Sufficiency criterion fallacies focus on the evidence, the weakness of evidence, or the lack of evidence provided. It includes fallacies of missing evidence and causal fallacies. The first technique is insufficient sample, which is also known as the fallacy of insufficient statistics or hasty induction. For example, a recent study of 20 women found catcalling prevalent, therefore this proves my argument. Usually a good example of this would also be anecdotal evidence, so this happened to me, so it must also happen to everyone, therefore it's a thing. The reason this is fallacious should be pretty obvious. The evidence provided is not really sufficient to back up your argument. Fallacy 2 is unrepresentative data, which is also known as biased sample. For example, a study of old men found that this was a true problem, therefore we should pass this bill which affects the entire population. The reason this is fallacious relates a lot to ethics in research and the sort of things you'll be considering at a university level in regards to your own research. Your sample needs to be representative of the whole population, and you can't just focus on one subset of the community, or that makes your research essentially invalid to be generalized, which is to be considered in regards to the whole world or to a wider context than what you studied initially. Fallacy 3 is arguing from ignorance, also called argumentum ad ignorantium. For example, the evidence you've presented here is insufficient and not clear, therefore failing any new evidence, I guess we should support my opinion. This is of course fallacious because the burden of proof exists with you. You cannot simply refer to someone else's argument and say that the evidence is lacking or insufficient or not clear enough, and therefore a decision should be made from ignorance rather than from a fact-based, evidence-supported theory. Fallacy 4 is contrary to facts fallacy, which is also called the speculative fallacy. For example, if we went back in time and I was Prime Minister back then we would have no terrorism today. And this is a fallacy because basically Back to the Future is a thing. And just speculating on what might have happened if you had have done things differently, if you had have taken the last shot in a basketball game, they may have won, is obviously just a bit silly really. 5 is fallacies of popular wisdom, also known as argumentum ad populum. For example, as my nonna always said, you shouldn't count your chickens before they've hatched, therefore we shouldn't invest in speculative mining. This is a fallacy because aphorisms, cliches, and folk wisdom really have no relation to arguments themselves. Fallacy 6 is special pleading. For example, you all as politicians should not be able to spend tax dollars on your own public transportation or forms of transportation. But me as Prime Minister, I must be allowed. And this is a fallacy because you should be consistent and you shouldn't make exemptions for yourself or for others based on their rank or position in the world. 7 is omission of key evidence, also known as fallacy of virtue. For example, though there has been a wide-ranging meta-analysis across many years on this topic, I would like to focus on the real people in my electorate. And this is of course a fallacy because if there's a key part of evidence in your argument, whether it supports your argument or not, you really need to address it and you can't just brusquely push it to one side. 8 is confusion of a necessary with a sufficient conclusion. For example, if we open our borders to refugees, we'll become a peaceful economic superpower. And this is a fallacy because the thing you've described may be a necessary condition for something to happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one follows the other. It doesn't necessarily suggest causation. 9 is causal oversimplification, also called causal reductionism or fallacy of the single cause. For example, it was the heavy security and warm weather that resulted in the shooting that followed. And this is a fallacy because not one thing can result in an event taking place. Things are very complicated and you can't really narrow it down to one or a small number of factors which cause something to occur. 10 is the post hoc fallacy, also called the post hoc ergo propter hoc. For example, I lost my wallet, then my job. I'm convinced if I had never lost my wallet, then I would still have a job today. And this is a fallacy because the sequencing of events doesn't necessarily mean any causation or any link is actually there. 11 is confusion of cause and effect. For example, when you see me, you also see Tom. Therefore, I must make Tom appear. So this is a fallacy basically because just because two things are linked or they happen in relation doesn't necessarily mean that there's cause and effect or causation. 12 is neglect of a common cause, also called a fallacy of origin or fallacy of virtue. For example, Australia has gone into a recession and unemployment is up. One must have caused the other. This is a fallacy because just because there's a common cause for two things doesn't mean that they are related. 13 is the domino fallacy, also called the camel's nose or the thin edge of the wedge, or absurd extrapolation. For example, if we allow gay marriage, what will be next? Marrying animals? Polygamy? And of course this is a fallacy because you can't predict the future and one thing does not necessarily lead to any other things despite how closely related they may be in your brain. 14 is the gambler's fallacy, also called the Monte Carlo fallacy. For example, I'm on a roll today, I must also be on a roll tomorrow. Better go back to the casino. So this is a fallacy because a thorough understanding of statistics would show that there's no real pattern in luck or outcomes, and therefore the gambler's fallacy is just that, a fallacy.